Today, I will be discussing the ethical dilemmas that FBI agent Joe Pistone had to face while deep undercover as Donnie Brasco in the Italian Mafia. Joe Pistone is currently a retired special agent with the FBI, but he grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, to an Italian American family, which is where he learned the Italian culture. He also has a knowledge of the mob from his childhood. He was able to observe how they walked, talked, acted, but the good influence that his family provided kind of pushed him away from that life. He was actually drawn to law enforcement. He went to military school, was in naval intelligence, and eventually accepted into the FBI. He began his career in the Jacksonville, Florida field office in 1969. He investigated bank robberies, fugitives, prostitution rings, gambling, car thefts, etc. He did do undercover work at that time, but he didn't start deep undercover work until he went to the New York field office in 1976, where he began his investigation into the Italian Mafia and the Five Families. He infiltrated the organization with the understanding that there would be no going home. He lived in an apartment. He had to cut ties with the outside world. He could only communicate with his family when it was deemed safe, and he would not be going into the office every day. He began his life permanently as Donnie Brasco, the jewel thief, which is a role that he would play for the next 6 years. To prove he was not a fugazi, he would learn a lot about the jewelry industry, lock picking, how to bypass alarms, crack safes, break into and hotwire cars, and he had to learn the street cost of a lot of the items that he would be fencing. He had to learn what the mob rules were, what a made guy was, not to mess with, disrespect, embarrass a wise guy, and not to get with a wise guy's woman or daughter. He learned that you don't take from the mafia because that's liable to get you whacked, and that he had to maintain and respect his credibility. His in was with Charlie the bartender. He did his first fencing there. He fenced some diamonds. Charlie the bartender came back with a payment. And then kind of introduced him to the mob life. They did a little more fencing, some gambling, and a lot of introductions. Donnie Brasco got in with Made Man Jilly. Made Man is basically a term for somebody who's been inducted into the crime family by killing somebody. Jilly ran a truck hijacking crew with the Colombos, and this continued for a while until eventually some of the Colombos began getting suspicious of Donnie. Donnie was getting his scores by taking confiscated and seized jewelry from the FBI and cashing it in basically with the mob. But he would turn down opportunities to go out and commit burglaries and things like that because he just didn't want to engage in crime. Well, when he was called out for that, he had to have a sit down with two of the Colombo members. One of them was a made man. And Donnie Brasco eventually had to fight his way out of it. He got into a fist fight with one of his accusers because he had to stand up for himself. Part of that whole maintain your respect and your credibility rule of being a mobster. After this fist fight, he fell out with the Colombos and began to hang around with the Bonanno family. Tony Mira took him in. Tony Mira was known for being ruthless and a killer. Agent Pistone, as Donnie Brasco, had to be very careful around Tony Mira and fell into a lot of questionable activities with Mira. He says one time he got into a melee with Mira at a bar. Some guy basically disrespected Mira, and no matter how much Agent Pistone, aka Donnie Brasco, tried to calm him down, Mira wasn't having it. Mira grabbed a bottle, cracked it against a table, and started stabbing the guy with the broken bottle. And to maintain his cover, Donnie Brasco had to engage in a fight with Mira against the civilian who had done nothing wrong. Situations like this that he found himself in were not in tune with the FBI. And the FBI's undercover rules were that you couldn't engage in violence, you couldn't commit crimes with firearms, and absolutely you couldn't commit murder. And the mob life was the exact opposite of those rules. So for 6 years, Donnie Brasco had to walk this line between the law and the mob, and he had to weave a web of lies and deception, and he had to know that one wrong move, one misspeak, one misstep could get him or anybody around him whacked, which is just mob term for getting him killed. He sacrificed his family and his friends for the greater good of justice and law and order. He ultimately had to live with the fact that he was befriending members of the mob, spending his life with them, his holidays with them, engaging in like normal friend activities with them just to set them up and let them down. He committed crimes such as hijacking, burglary, receiving and selling stolen property, extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and even a little bit of drug trafficking while he was undercover as Donnie Brasco. And although he never committed a murder, his capo, Sonny Black, spread the rumor that he had offed somebody. Additionally, he had firsthand knowledge of hits and murders that were committed. Ultimately, the rewards were worth it, in my opinion. He was able to identify, through his undercover work, key players in the entire mafia of all 5 families. He was able to identify who they were connected with. He provided intelligence on the inner workings of the mob, what kind of crimes they were committing, schemes they were running, and ultimately how they were interacting and working together, which wasn't something that the FBI was initially aware of. He also was able to conduct joint operations that led to intelligence in other jurisdictions and convictions in other jurisdictions. Ultimately, RICO charges were taken out by the FBI against members of the mafia. Over 100 federal convictions were had. Mobsters received long-term prison sentencings. Murderers, traffickers, violent criminals were taken off the streets and loosened the hold the mafia had on the New York area. Things ultimately got dicey when Sonny Black proposed that Donnie Brasco become a made member. Sonny Black had already been spreading the rumor that Donnie Brasco had killed somebody, so it wasn't a requirement for him to become a made member. However, there was a war brewing within the Bonanno family, and on May 5th, there was a triple murder of 3 of the capos. And after that murder, Sonny Black assigned Donnie Brasco his first contract to kill, the son of one of those capos, Bruno Indelicato. Donnie Brasco said in an interview that he absolutely had no choice. When he was assigned that contract kill, it was, this is the kill, you're getting in the car with these guys and you're going to this address and you're going to do it now. There was no delaying it. There was no time to get in touch with his superiors. And he quoted, if we go to that address and Bruno was there, Bruno's a dead man. It was either kill or be killed in that scenario. After this happened, I apologize. This didn't actually occur because Bruno happened to not be there, which was very lucky for Agent Pistone because he could have faced some serious charges. After this happened, in July of 1981, there was a meeting with Trafficante in Florida, which was very important to the operation because it allowed some other jurisdictions to connect with the mafia family, and the FBI was able to get those guys as well. But after this meeting in July, the FBI pulled the plug on the operation and said it was too dangerous. And this was several months shy of Agent Pistone being inducted into the Bonanno crime family as Donnie Brasco. That was supposed to happen in December. Even though Agent Pistone pled his case and said that becoming a made man would open a lot of doors to a lot of different intelligence, the FBI shut down the operation in July and said that the risk was absolutely not worth it because if Joe Pistone died after being found out, then all that work would be for nothing because Pistone would no longer be alive to testify at trial. The ethical dilemma that I want to discuss and explore is whether or not the authorization of these crimes and the failure to intervene during the commission of the crimes was ethical or not given the positive outcome of the investigation. Using the Kantian approach, Agent Pistone's actions of committing certain crimes would absolutely not be ethical because everyone was not treated as an end in themselves. And sometimes individuals were used as a means to accomplish the ends of others, particularly the mafia members and the victims of the crimes. Both of those groups of people were used to accomplish the ends of the FBI. And the ends of the FBI was to bring down the mafia family. Additionally, deception, violence, and law breaking, if it was applied as a universal law or a universal rule, that would lead to absolute chaos, which would again not be ethical. So the consequences of using this approach would be that his actions would not be authorized, and the Italian mafia would still be out committing violent crimes and trafficking drugs and humans throughout New York. Victims of the crimes would still be being victimized, and it just wouldn't be a good approach to use in this scenario. The utilitarian approach focuses on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Agent Pistone's actions would affect a lot of different people, including himself, the FBI, the mafia members, the victims of the crimes, their families. Their happiness and net unhappiness would have to be weighed using different factors of evaluation like number, intensity, duration, and certainty. But if those calculations were made, ultimately, the result would be that the commission of those crimes to maintain his cover would lead to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. The consequences were overall good, therefore his actions were ethical. Some of the consequences of using this approach would be that his actions would be considered justified. He would be able to continue his undercover work, and it would lead to the arrest and conviction of over 100 violent criminals. However, this approach is not without its critique, and the reason I wouldn't use it is because although it works in this case, and Agent Pistone's actions were good and the motives behind his actions were good, that's not always the case. There are evil motives and evil actions that can be allowed under this theory. Additionally, minorities can be allowed to suffer at the expense of the majority, and that's just not ideal. Consider if the mafia was the majority in this scenario. This approach would allow their actions to be justified, and the consequences of their actions would be justified, and it would all be considered ethical. The justice and fairness approach is one that operates under the mantra equals should be treated equally and unequals unequally. So when Agent Pistone is committing certain crimes or not intervening in the commission of certain crimes, is he treating all people equally? And the answer is no, he's not. The justice and fairness approach then would ask, is the difference in treatment justified? And it depends on how you look at it. So the answer could be yes or it could be no. Is the difference in treatment justified when you consider the overall consequences 6 years later when all these members of the mafia are arrested and convicted and crime rates drop and victims get justice? Well then, yeah, the difference in treatment is justified. The victims that he treated unequally would be for a good reason. However, in the moment and during the 6 years where nothing is happening, the difference in treatment isn't really justified and can lead to social unrest and can cause great harm to the victims involved. So, is the action ethical? The answer is possibly, depending on how you look at it. It could be yes, it could be no. The one good thing that does come from using this approach is the result of compensatory justice, and that's defined as just compensation that is proportional to the loss inflicted. So all of these years, mafia members have just been wreaking havoc on the streets of New York and getting away with it. No one has been able to hold them accountable, especially in such a massive way. And his actions do eventually lead to these victims getting some compensatory justice. Some critiques that I have of this approach are that we don't know who gets to decide what's just and fair in this scenario, or how we gauge what's just or fair in this scenario. And the outcome and the answer of like whether this is ethical or not can depend on that answer. And equality across the board is not always possible. There are victims who just aren't going to get justice because Agent Pistone was not able to collect enough intel. And Agent Pistone himself doesn't really seem to be treated fairly because he's not fairly compensated for his time, his effort, the danger he constantly put himself in, and the negative results for his family. The just intelligence approach is one of my favorites because it acknowledges that there are going to be harms that are going to be caused and requires that justifications are met for each of these harms. Additionally, there is a ladder of escalation that weighs the level of harm to the level of threat being posed. So some of the harms that absolutely are caused by Agent Pistone's actions are physical integrity, albeit rarely because he tries not to engage in physical harms to the best of his ability. Mental integrity, autonomy, and privacy. There's a little bit of violations of liberty and human dignity, but not as much as the others. Are the justifications met? I believe that just cause, intention, proportion, last resort, those are all met in this scenario, but authority and discrimination are iffy. He doesn't always have the correct authority in certain instances, especially where time is of the essence. Additionally, discrimination is not always met because anytime he's committing these crimes, the victims are not legitimate targets. And even though the mafia members are, they're not the only players in this game. As far as a ladder of escalation goes, there is a level 5 harm because he's infiltrating an organization that prides itself on trust, and there is a level 5 threat. So those are equal. The level 5 threat being that the community is constantly faced with murder, violent crimes, property crimes, etc. So some of the consequences and critiques I have of this approach, even though it is my approach of choice, is that Agent Pistone would have been sufficiently handicapped by utilizing this theory in regard to authority and discrimination. Delays caused by authority not being met or having to be met in a longer period of time could blow his cover and lead to him getting whacked. And the approach doesn't leave a lot of room for split-second decisions that were necessary for him to make. Another critique I would have is that there's a lot of discussion about whether torture is ethical, but not whether physical harm that does not amount to torture is ethical. There were some additional consequences that stemmed from all of this, one being that Agent Pistone had to live with these consequences for better or for worse. He has to deal with the mental anguish, some bleeding between his real life and the persona he lived with for 6 years, and he currently still has a $500,000 hit on his head. Joe Pistone's wife and daughter suffered. While he was away, he wasn't able to interact with them, be with them, provide for them, or build a bond with them. The mob members were deeply affected by the betrayal of Donnie Brasco. They suffered some mental anguish, and the ones who invited him in to the mob ended up being whacked. The victims who were affected only because of this operation should be mentioned. There were things that Agent Pistone brought into effect, particularly dealing with other jurisdictions and victims who wouldn't have faced these consequences otherwise. And then last but not least, the Bonanno family, among others, were eventually able to rebuild, and I am not certain if this would have happened if Donnie Brasco was allowed to become a made man. So a question that I have for your consideration has to deal with Donnie Brasco becoming a made man. Given that the rumor was already out there that Donnie Brasco had murdered someone, and him staying undercover until December to become a made man would not have required him to kill anyone, did the FBI make the right call in pulling the plug? I'll leave that to you to decide.